recommendations. Rylan, what day was it? One of the early meetings.
September.
In September. And so in December, we'll be moving forward the report with all of the agreed upon recommendations. So we'll follow up with that. I just want to remind everybody that this meeting is being recorded for note-taking purposes. So just be aware of that. And I'm going to start first by looking for a motion to approve the meeting minutes from August 28th. So would anybody be willing to make a motion?
Yeah, I
got to roll call. That's a good point. I can't do that without a quorum. Thank you, Rylan. We're going to do roll call and then we'll approve the minutes. Okay. If I call your name, please raise your hand, say aye if you're online or in the room. Delegate Dana Stein. Eric Myers. I saw Bob Allen online.
I'm here.
Here.
Randy Espinola.
Eric Myers.
All right, yeah, Eric Myers just joined. Matt Rowe. Ann Hairston Strang.
Yep.
Sarah Bender.
I'm here.
I see Tom Carr. Clifford Mitchell. Debbie Hare Cornwell.
Here.
Thank you. Nadia Shahab.
I'm online.
There's Alice Bregler. Catherine McCall. Maybe other CCS folks sitting in.
I can represent.
Christine is here representing Catherine. Meg Safel. And apologies if I mispronounced that.
That's fine. You're good.
And how do I pronounce it just for future reference?
It's Chafai. It's a Maltese name. Tricky.
Chafai. Thank you. John Bapalou. And Bill Fawcett.
Here.
All right, do we have a quorum? We do. Now we can approve the meeting minutes. I'll entertain a motion to approve.
I move to approve the minutes from August.
Thank you. Do we have a second? All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Hi.
All right. The meeting minutes have been approved. And I also just want to remind everybody that these working group meetings and recordings are now going to be uploaded to the Commission's YouTube page. So if you'd like to view any of the presentations, go back and take a look at anything, you're able to do that now through the Climate Commission YouTube. We've got a lot of things to go through. I'm just going to touch on what we're going to discuss today in the agenda before jumping in. We're going to start with a kind of regularly scheduled programming with the Office of Resilience update. We'll then have a presentation from Dave Curson at Audubon about Marches for Tomorrow. We'll then have Rachel and Dylan, DNR's very own, present on wetland adaptation areas. We'll talk through the 2025 work plan. We'll hold a little bit of space for the policy discussion. As we all know, at the end of the year, like we're doing right now, we vote on recommendations. And so we're trying to have a consistent dialogue about those potential policy opportunities. And then we will end with public comment, wrap up its next steps. So if you're a member of the public, we will be going to that as the final pieces of the agenda, and we'll just ask that you put your name in the chat so we can call and recording. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn it over to Mike Hinson, the Chief Resilience Officer, for any updates you might have about Office of Resilience.
Sure. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Secretary. Well, first I should say, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh,
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear. Okay, good. So first thing is going to be, some of you may have seen, we had a press release regarding the Resilient Maryland Toolkit. So that is now live online with resources. Most of the resources at this time are focused around various tools that can be used for resilience planning and also funding streams. So that is now live and out there. It's at resilientmaryland.com. We're working on the .gov currently, but for right now, resilientmaryland.com. So we implore everybody to take a look at that if you haven't already. And give us feedback right when you go into the page. There's a very obvious option to take a survey. So we're looking for any and all feedback. This is the first version out there, and we are already working on the feedback we've received to this point for a version 2 we hope to get out in early 2025. Next would be, we also have a newsletter that came out earlier this month. Some of you, many of you probably received it. If you have not, or if anybody's interested, please just reach out to our office. You can reach out to me directly, mike.hinson@maryland.gov. Happy to add whomever. That list, it really, the newsletter really highlights resilience work around the state, best practices, funding opportunities and upcoming funding schedules, as well as just general resilience items that pop up as far as tools and other federal programs that kind of emerge especially as we deal with this administration change. We'll obviously have more than likely some changes to programs that we'll have to make sure everyone is aware of, and all that stuff is communicated well. And then one last thing, I'm not sure if this was mentioned in the last call or not, but in September, we had an executive order signed by the governor, and basically just supported the legislation that created the Office of Resilience in the state, and also created liaison positions within all of the departments in the state of Maryland, as well as MIA and MEA. So that is fantastic and a great way for us to continue communicating and making sure that we're coordinating across the state all of our various resilience efforts. So just want to stop there and take any questions if anybody has any, and thank everybody for giving me just a few minutes today.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike, for the update and all of the work by you and your team. I think, obviously it's very top of mind for all of us at ARWG, and I really appreciate this kind of ongoing dialogue, so we can stay abreast of what you're all doing and what we're doing, and how we can work most effectively together. So thank you very much. We're going to have a presentation by Dave Curson, who's the Director of Bird Conservation in Maryland. Before we go to Dave, though, I just wanted to turn it over to Rylan to set the stage a little bit about the conversations that we're going to be having today.
Thank you. I am going to share just a slide real quick, and I want to do a quick shout out to Natasha over here in the pink, as you can see her on the camera. She helped me put together this slide. She's been diligently working on some of the next gen stuff and helping us move forward. But what I wanted to do before we have the presenters today is kind of touch base on how this touches with next gen. So there's a lot of crossover in the work you're about to hear about. We listed out right here, resource ready priority number 1 is the primary touch point here. Both of these efforts actually make great progress on this priority, as well as resource ready priority number 3. So I wanted everybody to get a look at that and see how, all these presentations that we hopefully will tee up for future discussions, we're also trying to bring back to next gen and show how we're making meaningful progress as we go. So I just wanted to bring it all back to a larger plan here as we move forward with some of our other presentations. All right, and now we can hand it over to Dave.
Thanks, Ryland. Do I have permission to share my screen?
Are you having issues?
Well, I guess I'm not very.
So if there's
I think I may have it here. Let's see.
arrow,
Yeah,
and that's how you should be able to share.
I think I got it. Let me see here. Hang on. Let's see. I am trying to. Let's see if I do that. Okay, so can you see that?
Yes, we can do.
Okay.
It is not in slideshow mode yet, though, just so you're aware.
Right. Yeah. I just need to. Whoops. Get it in there. Oops. Excuse me. How's that?
That is also not showing slideshow mode.
Oh. It is for me. Let's see.
If you share your entire screen, it should do it Okay.
Okay. I do apologize. Let me try
Oh.
again here. So, okay. So, okay. And let's see. How's that?
Nope, we don't see anything right now.
Oh, I do apologize.
It's okay.
I'm not familiar with.
If you want me to share, you have to grant me access on Google Slides, so you can do that in your email real quick and I can share for you.
Right. Okay. Let's see. Google Slides. Let's see. So I'm not sure I know how to do that, unfortunately. So-
You should have gone to your email, the
Yes.
request access.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. Okay. Let's see. Okay, that must be. Let's see, Google Slides.
Do you see the email request?
I do, yes. It was in my Google email rather than. Yep. Okay, so editor, share. All right, so share.
Yep.
Okay, I think I've done that now.
Great, I've got it and I can share from my screen if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So I'll cancel sharing. Great. Okay, thanks. We got there. Can everyone see the slide?
Yep.
Okay,
Just let me
great.
know when you would like me to advance.
Okay, thank you. I will do. So I'm David Curson with Audubon Mid-Atlantic, and we've been working on this project Marshes for Tomorrow for over a year now. But I'll introduce the topic on the next slide by showing you a picture of. So if you can advance the slide. This is in Worcester County, and the tidal marshes here, right by the Maryland coastal bays. You can see the state of them. Extraordinary erosion in the marsh interior, and in the coastal bays, this kind of amount of erosion is really a fairly recent phenomenon, just the last 15 years. 15 years ago, this marsh at Public Landing was fairly intact, and in fact, the rapid erosion and breakup of Maryland salt marshes that we're seeing at the moment is the vast majority of it is interior erosion rather than shoreline erosion. Next slide. And the future of our marshes has been modeled by the sea levels affecting marshes model, SLAM, which many people I'm sure are familiar with. And I want to point out something about the future trajectory over the next few decades. Many of the sea level rise scenarios that SLAM has modeled show the acreage of tidal marsh is actually increasing over the next 20, 30 years. But even those that do that, you can see that the high marsh, the marsh is split into two zones, high marsh and the low marsh. The high marsh that's above mean high water is declines rapidly as it converts to low marsh. And the high marsh zone is important for has many ecological functions that the low marsh does not have. And so this is a real concern. We're going to lose a large portion of our high marsh in just the next 25 years. Next slide. Now, when high marsh does convert to low marsh or even to ponding and open water, there are methods of restoration that we can use. Basically, I'm dividing those into two categories. If the marsh is still high enough to drain, i.e. if it is still high marsh, then you can solve plant dieback and ponding issues by managing the surface hydrology with small channels called runnels that allow trapped surface water to escape, and that can revive the marsh. But if your marsh has already subsided below mean high water, then you're going to need to add sediment to raise the marsh surface. And that is a lot more expensive. This $20,000 an acre is probably way out of date now. Many of the projects cost a lot more than that. Next slide, please. And the amount of restoration that we've seen so far in Maryland, it really isn't enough to keep pace with the scale of the issue. So we do need to scale it up. Now, being Audubon, we have a focus on birds, and there's a whole suite assemblage of bird species that live only in the marshes. And one of these birds is the salt marsh sparrow. It only lives in the high marsh zone, and it's endemic to the northeastern United States. And Maryland actually supports 1/4 of the world's population. But this species is declining rapidly, around 9% a year, and could well be extinct in about 30 years. So the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, which is a coalition of bird conservation organizations and state and federal agencies, has produced a salt marsh sparrow conservation plan to try to prevent this extinction. And in that plan, there's a target population goal for Maryland of 6,300 individuals, and it's estimated that it would take about 25,000 acres to support this population. Now, this actually gives us a handy target for marsh restoration goals. And although you might think this is just a single species goal, the salt marsh sparrow can really act as a figurehead, an indicator, or a conservation umbrella for the entire high marsh ecosystem. Next slide. And so with this in mind, the Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of years ago gave Audubon some funding to do two things: to produce an implementation plan for tidal marsh restoration, and really to do this at a landscape scale in Maryland, and also to start implementing projects on the ground. So we called the whole venture Marshes for Tomorrow. We established this as a project of the Delmarva Restoration and Conservation Network. And there are 3 objectives in Marshes for Tomorrow. The first one is to identify the 25,000 acres of target tidal marsh that we will try to maintain long-term through management and restoration. And then secondly, to come up with a restoration strategy, a schedule of restoration actions that it would take to do that. And so that's our kind of planning phase. And we also wanted to have community input to try to get the broad approval of local communities for this plan before we start implementing. So we got funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service of $1.7 million altogether, and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, $416,000 to expand the scope of Marshes for Tomorrow to the coastal bays, to increase the community engagement work, and to hire a biologist for monitoring. The next slide. This map just shows the geographic extent of Marshes for Tomorrow. It really focuses on the larger marsh areas in the middle Chesapeake Bay, and then over into the coastal bays. And those areas amount to about 67,000 acres. So we need to, our process was to narrow that down to 25,000 acres, find the best marsh within that. Next slide. So this just shows the scope of our partnerships. We've engaged with many partners on quite a few working groups over the last year, and we're very thankful to their participation. Next slide. So our process has been largely through a variety of working groups. You can see there's a bunch here. The core analysis team were our kind of board of scientists who worked on spatial modeling. We had technical workshops and focus groups at which we had agency folks and non-profit partners, review the models and think about the prioritization process. And our community engagement team has been engaging the local communities on the Lower Eastern Shore through a marsh use survey and a series of community meetings at which we got people's feedback. Next slide. So how do we identify our target 25,000 acres? I guess I can get a little bit scientific here. And on the next slide, I'll kind of kick off that description. So we built a marsh condition model using two lines of data. The first is SLAM to represent the elevation of the marsh, because that's a key component of how resilient it will be to future sea level rise. And then we built in the unvegetated vegetated ratio, which is a measure of how eroded the marsh is. And we integrated those two types of data, and we analyzed all of the marshes on the Lower Eastern Shore by marsh units, which have already been defined by the US Geological Survey, their coastal wetland synthesis. And on the next slide, it shows how this is an aerial photo of part of Fishing Bay in Dorchester County. The marsh is there, and you can see how that area of marsh kind of translates into our marsh condition model, with class 1 being the best marsh, the most resilient, the least eroded, the healthiest, and class 4 being the least healthy. Next slide. So from this marsh condition model, we were able to build a marsh restoration model based on the assumption that if your marsh is still high marsh, the most likely restoration method it will need, if there's interior ponding that's expanding, is hydrological repair. And if your marsh has gone below mean high water, if the elevation has subsided, you're going to need to place sediment. And so we extended this restoration model across the marshes of the lower shore as well. Next slide. And from the marsh condition model and some vegetation work that we did, we built a marsh prioritization model to get us towards our target 25,000 acres. And as well as those, we included marsh migration corridors and sources of sediment, which were basically navigation channels and dredging operations. And you can see the weightings there that we used. So on the next slide, I believe we have additional criteria that we used in the marsh prioritization. These weren't weighted factors in a kind of a calculation, but they were maps that we, in our focus groups, we examined and just kind of used that information. Land ownership, salt marsh spare abundance, community feedback and community infrastructure, protected lands, and with an organizing principle that we should try to conserve large contiguous blocks of marsh. Okay, next slide. So what products came from this? We were able to identify and map 29,000 acres of priority marsh areas. So we went over our target a little bit. It's good to have a little bit of redundancy in this plan. Our restoration decision model, which you can see the example for Blackwater Fishing Bay there on the left, that really gives us spatially explicit restoration recommendations for all of these priority marsh areas. And so we're also able to estimate the acreages to which we need to apply each restoration practice, remembering that some areas are still healthy and don't need restoration yet. And then within each of the focal areas, Dorchester County, a couple of places in Somerset, and then the coastal bays, we convene focus groups to think about the sequencing of how these restoration actions should occur. And I want to emphasize that these models really give us, they're really for landscape scale planning. When we get to site level projects, you really need to get on the ground, take measurements and do a site level assessment. So I want to emphasize that point. Next slide. Another product we created was this GIS Experience Builder, and I recommend you take a look at this. It actually shows up on Google now. It's published, and you can examine all of the data layers we use to build these models, and you can also examine the models themselves. There's explanations on the website for how we created them and where the data sources came from. So I'd encourage people to take a look at that. Next slide. So, you know, from this whole experience of doing these models and looking at the numbers, just want to share with you some thoughts about what the future holds for Maryland's salt marshes, the high zone of the tidal marsh. Basically, you know, the large marsh platforms that we have, which historically have been 80% of our tidal marshes, will effectively have converted to low marsh, mudflats, or open water by 2070. And we're gonna, if we don't do anything, we're gonna lose that ecosystem. Upslope marsh migration is important, and it's often heralded as kind of the answer. I don't think that's the case. It is important, but it's not the answer, because upslope marsh migration can only replace a small fraction of the marsh that's going to be lost to sea level rise. I think it's really worth bearing that in mind. Thirdly, we really can't save all or even most of today's marsh, because the costs of restoration are really too high for us to be able to do that. But if we do act soon, and if we start with a series of low-tech hydrological restoration methods like runnels, which are fairly cheap, we can buy time and revive the vegetation of the marshes somewhat, encourage some vertical accretion, and you know, we will still have to apply sediment later. We can slow this process. We can't really stop this process of marsh loss. And when we do come to need sediment placement in a widespread way, that's going to be a bit of a shock to us all, because it's not only very expensive, but we're going to need to explore some novel sources of dredge material for doing that. Next slide. So for the implementation phase of Marshes for Tomorrow, we have our first on-the-ground project in Somerset County. We've applied for the permit, and we plan to do some runneling there. And there's a couple of ways in which our plan can help other planning efforts that are ongoing. The Maryland State Wetlands Adaptation Plan, we've been talking with DNR, and there's a desire there to integrate Marshes for Tomorrow into that. And then the Chesapeake Bay Trust Tidal Wetlands Strategic Plan, I've been working with those folks as well, and I think that the models we've created could be extrapolated across the Chesapeake Bay watershed into Virginia as well. Next slide. So next steps for implementation. We've been very busy writing the report for this plan, and in December we'll be putting out a full draft for partners to review. In the winter, we'll start meeting with private landowners to set up additional restoration projects. And then from then on, really, it's about implementation and actually putting these plans on the ground or on the marsh. And the next slide, this may be the end. Is there another slide, Ryland?
No, that's it.
Okay, that's it. So I'll be very happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Great, thank you very much, Dave. I think yeah, I'm sure there's be a bunch of questions. I just want a quick reflection here. I really appreciate you know, the charismatic megafauna, right? The ability to tell the story of marsh restoration through a species. You know, that doesn't grab everybody, but I think it does create an ability for kind of narrative building around this work. To your point, you know, we're protecting ecosystems and doing habitat restoration through this, which benefits a significant number of species. And our ability to have clean water, you know, a wide range of things, a wide range of ecosystem services. So I think that's for me, I think a really, you know, really unique part of the project that you've put together. So just a reflection. I see Jim George has his hand up for MD.
Yeah, Jim.
Yes, you seem to indicate you were focusing on the high marshes.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Exactly.
And is that the same area that is eroding internally to the
Yes,
marshes?
it is, and it's interesting. You might think, well, why would high marshes erode internally? Well,
And that's the question.
Sorry?
And that's the question.
Oh, it is. Okay. Well, our marshes are very flat. Remember that our tidal range is only 2.5 feet. And because our our marsh platforms have basically come to be created within that very flat range, it means that it's really easy for water to get stuck on the marsh. So even when you have high marsh, you can have a lot of trapped water. And with sea level rise, those flooding events are becoming more common. And so trapped water is really, it's destroying our high marshes a lot faster than a simple SLAM model would suggest. And that is, I think, a point that many people don't realize. I think it's really essential for us to bear that in mind and do this surface hydrological work to let that water escape.
And it's the trapped tidal water. It's not really fresh rainwater. So
Well, it's a combination of, most of it is tidal, but we know also there are many places where rainfall can actually find its way overland onto the marsh surface, at tidal marsh surface too. So,
and hence the runnels that release the water out of there is one of the solutions.
exactly, and it's pretty cheap to do. Yeah, it's a fairly new technique, though. We still need to kind of research the finer points of it, the nuances in terms of exact elevations and things like that.
Thanks, Dave. That's helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome. Eric, I see you got your hand up.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Eric.
Great presentation, of course. I wondered if you want to talk a little bit more about how you're going to monitor and continue to report on the progress. I mean, what you said is exactly right. It's all implementation. How are you going to keep track, and who will you be reporting to in terms of the progress that you're making towards the goal?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's not yet defined, but I have a feeling that, you know, as MDE and DNR develop their the state wetlands adaptation plan, we could build a program of kind of tracking and monitoring into that. That's one option. Also, there's a group of restoration practitioners, the Marsh, see if I can get this right, the MCRA, the Maryland Coastal Restoration Alliance. And we meet every few months, and we're actually kind of working on a monitoring plan to monitor the state of the marshes as the marshes change, and we kind of update our models. So those are two thoughts for monitoring those two different things, tracking and monitoring.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Dave, thanks. Excellent presentation. And I think it's great, you know, you have your charismatic megafauna, being central to this with the conservation values that species needs.
Yeah.
As you move forward, I have two thoughts. One is making sure that it's helping out all the other species that also lives in that high marsh, or like you're more explicit about how it's helping those other species in the high marsh. And two, how it's really even helping the homeowners, by protecting those marshes, it's ultimately protecting homeowners further upland. And how critical that is to the whole ribbon of our coastline, particularly on Delmarva.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, when I give this talk to public audiences, I have this small series of slides about the value of the marshes, and I have their economic value for fisheries and the buffer against storm surge and the blue carbon thing. I didn't put that in for this audience because I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but we are trying to put those messages of, you know, the kind of the value proposition of the marshes out there as well. So I take your point very seriously. Yeah.
Thank you.
Questions. Hi, Dave. It's Jen Rollin with DNR.
Hi, Jen. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
The private landowner restoration. Have you identified funding sources for those?
Well, we have some to start us off, because part of that 1.7 million from Fish and Wildlife is from their Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. And so that allows us to work on private lands. And so over the next couple of years, we're going to be, meeting up with landowners. We've already kind of identified who those landowners are within these priority marsh areas. So we're going to meet them, talk with them, and see if we can get restoration going on their land with that, starting with that money. And I think that money, it might not be enough to kind of do an awful lot of implementation, but I think that we can design and permit a bunch of projects and do some, and then, raise more money for the construction of those projects.
Will the private landowners be involved in providing input on the design of their projects? I'm thinking about some of the comments that Secretary and Dave had, also from being involved with the Deal Island conversations. Designing for habitat is one thing, but designing for some of the concerns that we're seeing in these marsh communities around flooding. So I just didn't know, is there going to be like one-on-one landowner engagement so that it feels like they're getting something out of this project too?
Yes, there will on the private lands, definitely. But I think one interesting point with that is
did
that.
I lose you? I think our.
Can you hear me? Oh, well, I
Dave,
think.
Dave, hold on one second.
Hold on.
We have to, in the room, have to make a quick change.
I don't know why it's doing that.
We're back. We're back. Thanks, Dave. Sorry about that.
Okay, great. No, it's a really good point, Jen. Yes, we will engage landowners one-on-one in the design stage. But it's interesting, most of these priority marsh areas, because we're focusing on large areas of habitat, are not right next to where people live. And so, but we do want to kind of bring benefits to local communities. And one idea that we want to follow up on is, as we raise money through grant programs for construction of projects, to pair like a habitat project with a nearby community project, and to kind of go for money that can cover both of those, to kind of package them together and bring benefits to communities that way. Because, I have to admit that most of our large areas of high marsh that we're targeting are often some distance from any, human dwellings. But I think with this kind of approach of pairing, we can hopefully make that work. And I know that Deal Island is a really great place to start with that, because I've talked with Christine Burns and some of the other folks at DNR about, some of the problems they're seeing with the ditches in Deal Island and Chance, and some of the other issues, living shoreline needs and stuff like that.
Great. I'm glad you're taking those conversations to heart, Dave. I think, if we're going to be having bulldozers down in some of these rural areas for some of these restoration projects, doing things like ditch maintenance and restoration, which is a real struggle for local governments down there, is just a win-win for both the natural and the built environment.
Yeah, exactly. And Hen Bellman, who's our coastal program manager on our Audubon team, as I think she's been on the Citizens Committee, the steering committee for DIP, over the last year or so. And I think that building relationships will kind of help us identify some of these community projects. So.
Thank you.
Dave, this is Eric again. I think that's well worth pointing out, but I also think the fact of having a larger buffer between where people are living, where critical infrastructure and flooding sources on the coastline is valuable. I mean, you just have to look at the contrary example coming from North Carolina with houses falling into the ocean and say you really don't want to be right next to where your flooding is coming from, that this buffer helps you, even if it's some distance. That distance is what's helping. So that's worth making that point as well, I think.
Yeah, that's good. I agree. And we see the need to kind of flesh out our engagement of local communities. And so, this community engagement team that Hen has been leading, along with Jared Parks of the Lower Shore Land Trust. We want to kind of morph that into a team that carries on with that engagement work really throughout the life of all of these projects going forward. So we do want to develop that community side. Yeah.
Thank you all very much for a really robust discussion. Dave, it's always a pleasure to have you, and really appreciate the work that you are leading with Audubon. I think a lot of synergy with what we're doing here, and that's really going to be borne out in our next conversation. So Dave, welcome to stay. Be part of the next conversation. If you have to jump, we understand that too, but really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will stay on for the next presentation. So thanks.
Fantastic. All right, so the next presentation we have is going to be from our Chesapeake Coastal Service, Dylan, and from Rachel, and they're going to talk about our wetland adaptation areas.
All right, yeah, so the presentation that Dylan and I can give is kind of piggybacking off what Dave was talking about. So we're going to be presenting on the wetland adaptation areas data set and the new marsh protection index. So as you know, Maryland wetlands are changing, and a lot more change is predicted over the next 30 to 70 years, mainly due to climate change and sea level rise. We did have our wetland adaptation area data set on Coastal Atlas previously, but it was dated, and we did have new inputs and SLAM data that we could use to update the wetland adaptation areas data sets. That was about 12 years old, and it was just updated this past year. And so the impetus for updating wetland adaptation areas, like I said, there's new SLAM data, which is what Dave was referring to earlier. I'll hit on that just a little bit in the next slide. The resolution for the SLAM data is at 10-meter raster grid cells as opposed to 30 meters, which was the last rendition of SLAM. We also have programmatic need to distinguish between uplands that convert to wetlands versus wetlands that persist. And finally, being able to have decadal time steps allows us to display the corridor of the wetlands as they migrate. So the SLAM data, this is what it looks like visually. You're looking at time zero, which is the base of the model. SLAM is a raster data set that uses digital elevation at 10-meter grid cells to predict the effects of long-term sea level rise. It incorporates accretion and erosion of sediments to determine the distribution of habitats. On the right, you can see the 25 different land types that SLAM displays. So how did we update the wetland adaptation areas? We use SLAM by picking a sea level rise scenario. There are 6 different ones within the new rendition of SLAM. The bottom of the graph you are looking at displays the decadal time steps from 2010, which is time zero, all the way to 2100. And the y-axis looks at sea level rise in meters. In feet on the very right, we have the most conservative sea level rise scenario of about 2 feet. And the most extreme is about 7 feet of sea level rise when converted from meters. And so we decided to go with the one that has about 4 feet of sea level rise by 2100. This is called the upper limit of likely range. You'll also see it as 17% growing, so they're interchangeable. But we decided to go with this one because it coincides best with Maryland's 2018 guidance document to sea level rise. And this is just a visual of what the SLAM data looks like in 2100 for these 6 different sea level rise scenarios. Top left is your Paris Agreement, which is the most conservative. And we're zoomed in on the lower eastern shore because that's where we see the most change from 2010 to 2100. The bottom right is our most extreme. And you can see that most of Blackwater is inundated by the end of the century. The bottom left shows the 17% growing, also known as the upper limit of likely range, which is the scenario we chose. Just wanted to visualize the 6 different scenarios that SLAM provides. So what went into SLAM? Just getting into the nitty gritty, you have your national wetland inventory, wetlands, your elevation LiDAR data, tidal ranges, dikes, impoundments, and then your sediment, erosion, and accretion. But the one thing I want to stress is that sea level rise is the only stressor within the model. It does not account for any anthropogenic actions. So no bulkheads or anything like that along the shorelines. So the resulting layers for wetland adaptation areas that come out of the new SLAM are these 11 layers that are now on Coastal Atlas versus the 1 layer that we had previously for the first run of wetland adaptation areas. We have our 3 SLAM layers for 2050, 2070, and 2100. We have our wetland adaptation areas for 2050, 70, and 2100. The index, our uplands to wetlands, and our drown layers, and I'm going to go through each one of these next. So this is what the SLAM data looks like for 2050, 2070, and 2100. It should look very similar to the base data of SLAM for 2010. It just shows the different land types that are present or projected to be present in the future time steps that we have chosen under the sea level rise scenario that we chose. Again, the top right just shows the 25 different land types present within Maryland during these time steps. Pulling from the SLAM data, we're able to pull out the wetlands or the wetland land types for the years 2050, 2070, and 2100. So we have that entire footprint of wetlands projected to be present for the 3 different time steps. And just so you all know, the wetland adaptation areas footprints show both wetlands that persist and wetlands that convert from uplands. So it has all the wetlands projected to be present. And just for clarification, 2050 represents a sea level rise of 1.3 feet, 2070 is 2.2 feet, and 2100 is that full 4 feet of sea level rise. Just so you know, the 2100 wetland adaptation area footprint is what went into the index, which is coming up soon. Pulling from the 2100 time step, we were able to distinguish wetlands that persist and wetlands that also convert from uplands. So this is a new and exciting layer. You're able to see quote unquote new wetlands that are projected to be present by 2100. And these are wetlands, like I said, that do convert from uplands. And this is something that our program was very excited about, as it was a need for our future work. And into that 2100 wetland index, we use the footprint for 2100 wetland adaptation areas. And then we created an index for trying to figure out which potential habitats might be high quality. So you have the footprint of wetlands that are projected to be present. And then we look at what is the size that is supposed to be present in 2100. We assign a score based on how big it is. We overlay our green infrastructure, and if that's present or absent over top of those wetlands, that would also get a score. Next is the hydric soils. Are they present now in the area where the wetlands are projected to be established? And what is the quality of said hydric soils? That gets a score. And finally, we overlaid BioNet, which is a data set of ecologically important lands based on wildlife, plants, habitats, and landscapes. And we total up the scores that were assigned based on each raster grid cell. And it had a possibility of scoring up to 60 points. That looks like this. So the entire footprint of the index is the same as the wetland adaptation areas. The entire footprint has the same chance or likelihood of having wetlands present. What we are scoring is the ability to project the potential for providing high quality habitats. So your low, which is your green, is a lower potential for high quality wetlands. And the red is high, which is a better potential for providing high quality habitats based on those conservation criteria. And just a reminder, here's what the SLAM looks like. If you can look at the bottom left, I did put a flag on James Island. And we were able to use the SLAM data to pull out open water, which is what we classified as drowned lands for our new layers available on Coastal Atlas. And this is what those drowned land layers look like. We have, again, 2050, 2070, and 2100. James Island flag is still there just for a point of reference. And the drowned lands layer is put on Coastal Atlas because it is meant to be used in conjunction with the wetland adaptation areas layers. So for example, you would turn on the drowned lands for 2050 and also the wetland adaptation areas 2050. And you can see that line of elevation where it transitions from open water to wetlands. And then when you turn on both layers for 2070, you can see that some of those wetland adaptation areas do become inundated by water. And as those wetlands move at higher elevation, that's where the drowned land layers come in. So you can visually see that. So how will this new data be used? We are targeting for parcels for conservation and also using wetland adaptation areas for reviewing proposals on Grants Gateway. And as Dave mentioned, we are also using wetland adaptation areas data for Maryland State Wetland Adaptation Strategy. And it is used as an input for the Marsh Protection Index, which Dylan will get into next.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so another index, but this one's a little bit different from the wetland adaptation areas that Rachel just described. This one's a little bit more focused on which marshes can protect vulnerable communities and which marshes are most likely to be affected by coastal hazards. And so these will be a little bit more human oriented to some of the discussions of earlier that Jen brought up and that Dave brought up, and you'll see that in the inputs to this index that I will describe next. And so to Rachel's point, we hope to use these results to prioritize areas for preservation and restoration. I have one slide at the end of this about our work for the recently awarded EPA's Climate Pollution and Reduction Grant. And so we're going to be getting into sort of the application of these indices that might seem, pretty huge and daunting, but we're hoping to use them to really drill down to areas to what Dave was working on as far as implementing restoration and conservation on the ground. So the Marsh Protection Index is currently in progress, and it's going to include, these are the kind of 5 focus areas. It's also an update of a previous index that we had from our coastal resiliency assessment, which was done a number of years ago. And so this will be updated in the next few months, but it's going to include a piece on marsh health. So the current and potential future of a marsh's ability to survive under climate change. And this is going to be using the USGS PRISM data. So Dave's model for marshes for tomorrow included UVVR, which is unvegetated to vegetated ratio. These little pins in the bottom left corner are not meant to actually be seen. It's I know you can't see this on the screen here, but but we're using the UVVR data along with USGS's elevation data, and they've actually gone and prioritized marshes in Maryland for restoration, protection, monitoring, and evaluating. And so that's going into our model to sort of give us a proxy for how healthy a marsh is currently. And then we're looking at the proximity to coastal hazards, and so sort of the exposure of marshes to things like wave action, to hurricanes, and their ability to withstand large storms. And so this is our current DNR hazard index that we're going to be inputting into the model, and it gives all these points along Maryland's coastline a score for how vulnerable they are to coastal hazards. And then we're including habitats, so a similar piece to what's in the wetland adaptation areas. This one's going to be including the proximity of a marsh to SAV, to benthic habitats like oysters, to dunes, and also to forests. So this will give us an idea of what habitats a marsh is close to that can help with protection. And then we're looking at proximity to people and those people's vulnerability. And so this gets into where are the people living on our coastline, and we'll look at how close a marsh is to where those people are living. So it uses some population modeling on density, and this is, you can barely see it down here, but this is kind of the Blackwater area, and you can see the white pieces are where people are living, and we're kind of taking that data and we buffered it out and created, some buffers to look at how close the marshes are to where people are living, so that we can score the marshes accordingly to how protected they are of our people. In addition to our how close a marsh is to our people, we're also looking at how socially vulnerable those people are in that area. And so marshes in a higher vulnerable area will be scored as higher protection. Finally, we are looking at the current protective capacity of marshes. We've created a wave attenuation index, which essentially looks at the marsh's current ability to reduce wave action. So a large storm or a wind event that creates a lot of the high water levels we're seeing today. We're incorporating that into how we are prioritizing our marshes for their protective value. And similar to the wetland adaptation areas, this is going to be combined together into an index that is going to be released in the next few months to be used in things like our 2025 wetland adaptation strategy with MDE, and also things like our $43 million that we have received through the Climate Pollution and Reduction Grant. So this is a really big grant, and actually Elliot Campbell here in CCS worked really hard on this grant application, and it was awarded through North Carolina, and we received a portion of this funding through EPA, and the plan for this money, there's a lot of it going out to Western Maryland for afforestation, and we're collaborating with TNC and the Western Maryland work to reforest some areas, but this slide is focused on what we're doing on the lower eastern shore. And so the climate equity and justice screening tool down here on the lower right part of the screen shows our focus areas for the shore. And we are doing some afforestation on the shore, which includes restoring 500 acres of Atlantic white cedar, some shortleaf pine, and some bald cypress. So these are species of trees that are vulnerable to climate change, but also are resilient to some level of inundation. We're going to be doing improved forestry management on at least 1,000 acres on the shore in these CEJST focus areas shown in the map. And we're also going to be creating regional forestry management plans with partners like TNC. We also have a blue carbon part of the CPRG, which looks to restore 200 acres of marsh. And a huge part of that is also going to be restoring living shorelines. So 400 acres of living shorelines, which is a lot of our shoreline in those areas. So that's really awesome. And then we will also be doing some tidal connectivity restoration. So to Dave's point about some of the runneling work, we're hoping to restore tidal connectivity in 400 acres of marshes in these areas. And finally, we're working with some private land managers or private landowners to implement coastal resilience management plans. So considering how they can best fortify their property to withstand the changes that are coming. And there's a community engagement portion of this grant as well, which will be working with project liaisons and we'll be engaging communities who will be compensated for their time and their energy. So that's a plan for CPRG. I don't know exactly all of the details of this. So if you have questions about CPRG, Elliot Campbell would be the person to talk to about this because he's been working a lot more on that work. But that's all we have. If questions, we're happy to answer.
So like you said, all we have to. And really, I think one thing I really appreciate about this is the continuous ability to layer factors together and then tell a consistent narrative. And I think, when we talk about resilience more broadly, I think it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. And I think tools like this really demonstrate to people kind of specific actions that we can take in projects that we're working on to build resilience holistically, site by site, thinking about what the work that Dave's doing, resilience for species, right? So this is, I think, I love it. I'm at DNR, so biased, I guess, but I think this is the kind of thing that is incredibly impactful as a tool of being able to help and assist others in learning long term. So really appreciate this part. Very impressive. I will open it up to questions. I get to ask these questions whenever I want. So any questions from those online? Yes, Commissioner Mizrahi.
Yes, this was a great presentation. I just wondered, when I look at presentations by Climate Central or that big one in the Washington Post today around climate resiliency, do they have advantage of this very helpful data at this point, or is this still emerging data that hasn't been incorporated into other models yet?
So Climate Central generally uses their own proprietary models for their work, and their work is generally very focused on people. But we actually met up with them earlier this year at a coastal resiliency site on the Eastern Shore, and so they're aware of the work that we're doing. And these models are really focused on Maryland and what we're doing with our marshes. But I know that Climate Central, knows about the wetland adaptation areas, and they have access to that data through IMAP and through Maryland's data sharing. So whether they use it in their models is up to them, and we hope that they will if they're doing sort of Maryland-focused projects as they were earlier this summer. But yeah, it's out there for sure.
What about, sorry, following up also, because there's a lot of financial connection to the loss of land, et cetera. Is there any sort of financial model that goes with this in terms of how much property taxes the state of Maryland could lose as ground goes underwater, for example?
I'm aware of some work that the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy did with a group out of North Carolina, and I can't remember what the name of that group is right now. But we could probably get that to you. It's just for the Eastern Shore. It's not for the other coastal zone in Maryland, but it was economic specific and it looked at losses.
Thank you.
I would think Commissioner Mizrahi, that's a really good point. I think we should flag that to you just to figure out maybe there's some other presentations we can have to think about how we can better incorporate some of that information, because I think that really is important for speaking to policymakers too, when they're weighing options, especially local governments.
So Owen Bailey presented on some of this data at the last meeting, was it? And so he didn't dive into the full span of their report, but he has given at least some of us at DNR hosted a meeting for him where he went into more of that economic data. Again, for the Eastern Shore exclusively, but I think that's good work that they're going to be publishing online if it's not already.
Dylan, could you maybe speak to, how members of the public, others can access and use this data themselves?
Yeah, so the Marsh Protection Index isn't out yet, but it'll be out in the next few months. But the wetland adaptation areas, Rachel can talk to this as well, but there's actually a story map on how to use some of that data. And you can, if you search wetlands on IMAP or on the Coastal Atlas, for example, is where a lot of this data is housed, which is a public mapper that anyone can use. There's a few different routes that you can go to accessing this data, and actually through our partners at MDOT, we've gotten the wetland adaptation areas on the climate change vulnerability viewer as well. And so, you know, working with our partner state agencies is also really important. And so they're sharing it on their mappers. You know, we share some of their data on our mappers so that hopefully people can use the data in conjunction with each other on the different mapping tools that are available.
Thank you, Joe. All right, any more questions online or in the room? All right, well, we're doing a very good job of staying precisely on agenda on time here. So Rachel and Dylan, thank you both very much. I know a great deal amount of work has gone into that from not only you all, but your team, which I think was serve with this. So thank you for that. I think, again, continuing to be able to show Marylanders kind of the impacts that we're going to see is critical for us to continue to educate and build support around this, the interventions that we're going to need to be able to do. So thank you all very much for that. Okay, we are going to pivot a little bit here and move into a discussion about the draft work plan, focusing on priority areas, deliverables to guide our quarterly meeting next year. So this is kind of like the look forward into next year, talk through the draft plan, and ensure that we're covering all of the things that we should as the work group, setting ourselves up to have robust recommendations for the Climate Commission. So I think Ryland is going to lead us through that discussion here today, and we're really excited and interested to take the feedback of the work group members.
Okay, this is the draft work plan that was distributed ahead of the meeting. So hopefully you all studied up and know exactly what I'm talking about, so I don't have to spend too much time explaining. I'm just going to do what I did last year, whereas I run down each individual item one by one. Again, this is a draft, so the purpose of this session here is for you all to provide input on what we have written here, and it will be finalized in our February meeting to direct the rest of the year's work plan here. But again, this is based on our recommendations that all passed in the commission annual report. So that is being used to guide us here in our work plan. So the first item up will probably not surprise anybody here because that is the next generation adaptation plan. The big task for us is going to be developing that reporting system and tracking progress on next gen priorities. So I think to me that was a no-brainer for indicating that we're going to continue to work on this item. Now I'm going to pause. Does anybody want to add anything or have any comments about next gen progress on our work plan here?
Is it worth it to reference the Office of Resilience directly? We have other state partners listed, but I think that like incorporation.
Specifically for next gen? Okay, I can add them to that paragraph above. So they have that section below.
Oh.
Good.
Sorry.
You can study.
Keep your mouth shut at meetings.
But it might be worth maybe motioning people down further in the document to see that it wasn't an oversight, because it is the first thing up there. Okay, letting the dead air sit, but I'm moving down. So the next item that we talked about a lot this year, I almost want to say last year, but it is this year, was compensatory community engagement. And so we had a great panel discussion this year and wanted to sort of continue the good work that we're doing. We know this is at the forefront for a lot of people, not just us. One of the items that we thought would be useful is working with the Department of Budget and Management to create a guidebook of existing mechanisms, because one of the things we heard in the panel was that there are some avenues that we can currently use to sort of make this work in the state system as it currently exists without having to modify legislation or do anything crazy. And so we thought it might be helpful to provide a sort of document that puts it all in one place. So you want to pay a community liaison. Here's options for you, including hiring, like how you can recruit that person without having to post it like it's a full state job. Things like you can use MOUs with nonprofits to potentially work with a third party to get to this point. Other things, like if you do want to contract an individual, what are things, pros and cons of options, and to look out for. So that's sort of the thought process behind here. Does anyone have any comments on this as a work plan item?
I think that would be helpful for those of us who would like to do it and haven't really figured out, you know, what procurement needs are.
Yeah, good.
So as you guys asked, it's their point.
Yes, or put them on the work plan, right? Make sure, and they are very interested in continuing to work with us, which is great, and we love to hear it. So looking forward to it.
This also could kind of build off of the CFAIR recommendations that talk about engaging people like during non-traditional work hours or weekends, providing transportation. So could make a connection.
That's a great suggestion, and maybe I should even actually build that language in this work plan item so it doesn't get lost. Any other thoughts on community engagement? Okay, scrolling on down. I assume someone will tell us if our sound comes out, by the way. But please use the chat if you no longer can hear us at any point.
Actually, we are the community compensation in some of our workforce elements.
We have not, but that's something I can look into. That's a good flag for me.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of,
Yeah,
in some ways they're different things, but I also see it as sort of avenues for entry.
yeah, that's a great point. Acting as a community liaison to definitely introduce someone to that line of work.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
And we talked about that. I think that we talked about how do you get built when we're doing stuff in the groups, how to build internal capacity. And so that's a really good idea. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I will definitely look more into that.
Internship programs, or whether it's whether it's, yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, we can learn, non-traditional pathways for our fiber trees folks. Yeah, they don't need to have traditional forestry degrees necessarily. Right. And, some of these are folks who just didn't find forestry when they were 16, 17 years old. They didn't hear about camp victory like I did. Right, no,
Yeah.
it's like, that's the difference. Yeah.
Yeah, assigning value to that sort of line of work that is not just
I didn't know what you said.
Mhm.
Right. Doctor, lawyer. That's what we're special.
But then you have a mechanism by which you can actually hire.
Yeah.
Right, and it makes it real.
Yeah, it makes it real, otherwise it's not real. Right?
Okay, well, any further thoughts on that? Online?
Oh, there's a comment in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Jennifer, do you want me to just read it out loud?
Actually, I guess I'm.
So my county, Anne Arundel County, is updating its 5-year hazard mitigation plan, but I'm not aware of whether other counties do such a thing. And is there a centralized place where we can find all of those plans for the whole state and help each other? Is that, when you're talking about supporting local governments, it seems like the hazard mitigation plans are very important.
Yes, hazard mitigation plans are not uncommon. I believe not all of them are posted publicly because sometimes there is proprietary information online. People in the room correct me if I'm speaking out of turn. Okay, that is correct. Great. Does that answer the question, Commissioner Zrahi?
And I think Vanessa from MDM, is your hand up related to this as well?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in that all counties, so basically in order to receive hazard mitigation grant program funding, all counties plus the state are required to have hazard mitigation plans that are updated every 5 years. I believe all of those are public. They're usually housed in the county offices of emergency management. But if you're having trouble finding a particular one, you can reach out to the state hazard mitigation officer, Kate Whiteleather, and she can point you in the right direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa.
All right. So moving on to item number 3, supporting local governments, which we kind of combined a couple different items of discussion from this past year. Brought in NextGen as a guide, but this is relevant to making our tools more accessible, but then also building in that flexibility for smaller municipalities and things like that in some of our grant processes. That's coming from our equity panel discussion. So generally, just discussing how we can better support these local units without further burdening them and throwing lots of tools at them, and all this stuff that we've been hearing is not very helpful. And so the deliverable for that one, I think, is a little more nebulous than some of the other ones that I put together on the work plan. I did just say we would devote future meeting time to discuss some of this, but I am open to any of the suggestions if members have suggestions on how to maybe tailor that discussion in a way that would be helpful. I will open the floor to discussion on this one. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Just want to make sure that you're aware that MDE and the Department of Planning have worked together on a website maintained by MDP that has information regarding, we focused on the water resources element of the local comp planning process. So that might be a starting point. And if you want more information on that, Jason Dubois and all those folks are aware of it.
Great, and this is a resource that compiles resources for people writing those comp plans. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great, yeah, that's a great start.
It one of the things it does is it makes a tie-in to the Lifeline framework of that FEMA and MDEM, use within their hazard planning, framework, basically.
Great, thank you. Jim, Cliff asked you a question in the chat. Is that the Climate Justice website or a different site?
It's different, although they recently, I think, added a justice element to it. I'll look for the site and drop it in the chat.
Great. Debbie might have linked it below here unless you're looking for something different. Okay. Any other points or specific work that we should use to guide this work plan item on accessibility and equitability local our local government support?
Ask them what they want. Right? I mean, I think there's a lot of different entities around the Bay delivering tools of different types that may or may not actually answer what the moment the local government's looking for. And I mean, you guys are doing flood bids. I mean, that's just one of the gazillion tools. So I think your idea of trying to have some panels and understanding, like, you build these sites, they have tools sit on them,
NOAA has some, they have thousands of tools. No one knows how to use them. No one knows what they're really for. They're accessible, they're categorized, but they still don't get used. So is it the tool problem or is it a delivery problem? And is it a question?
And so how do we, as in our purview, tackle that question?
I would suggest, well, maybe starting with a series of panels and AWRT, like bring in maybe some local government folks to talk about what they want and bring in some of the folks that are delivering tools now, maybe who's aggregating. And that might be a way to sort of start an idea of more effective way to, and it ties in nicely with this community liaison idea. They're all connected. It's how do we get information that can be used, that people want to use to do something actionable, like the cookbook, right? But the cookbook's complicated, right? Because it requires human interaction, not just a state, and that's hard and expensive to do. But we all grab it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how open people will be coming to this meeting and talking about, but I think maybe that's a way to start, or else fund some focus groups that also do the same and bring that information in. God knows there's so many, like that coordinator meeting we helped run just this summer. We just said, who's the coordinator in the Bay? And a lot of people came to that meeting to say, I don't know, well, we're coordinating names. Where's the network of networks of coordinators? So there's a lot of people doing this. The website's not going to do it, but I think DNR has that overarching capacity where you can sort of make some decisions and drive.
But one of the issues that we're working on within forestry is invasive species management, and we're looking at standing up regional prisms, the partnerships for regional invasive species management. We have a couple in the state, but I think that's a gap I feel like we have in something that's important to resiliency. We have some funds, private landowners, local governments don't have a lot of options. And they can't use the NRCS or necessarily the same cost shares that are available for private landowners. And we have a lot of land, they have a lot of land. And so even just the information on invasive species management is hugely valuable, but then also just what can get them started and understand what's useful local investments. And I think that would be a very huge and practical kind of thing. So we're still trying to figure out how you stand up and fund these. Two people in that project that are doing a lot of different projects, but this is the approach that's been identified to try and have DNR be a part of that sort of regional coordination. Knowing the circumstances on the shore are pretty different from mountain down.
I was just going to add that we did a market analysis needs assessment in 22 to 23 that was more CCS focused, but how do people, what are they looking for from the tools that we provide in DNR? And that could be a good basis document for some of this too. Some of the feedback that we got in that was, please not another tool, but like, how do I use the tool that's there? And so I think some of those ideas would be really helpful.
Yeah, great clap.
Lost in the COVID fog.
Yeah.
So I just want to build on Christine's comment. It would be really interesting, and maybe the coastal training program is part of this. But to do like some learning labs when you get the local governments in or community leaders or whatever, and you start answering on the fly. What's your question? Let's pull out, and really demonstrate how the tools can be used to answer the questions.
that our audience asks. You know, and sometimes I feel like there's not that connection. Like we're developing tools and we know what's important and have conceptions on how that might be used. But you know, even something interactive like that where you can have some case scenarios and because right now we've got, you know, we still have a list of tools. And we have a lot of them.
Hi. Last year, no wait, this year, earlier this year during Flood Awareness Month, we had 2 webinars, and one of the webinars let people submit questions about flooding throughout the state of Maryland, just in general, what do you need help with, exactly like what you were saying, Christine. And it was actually pretty well attended from people throughout the state. I think like 30 people came, but you know, I was able to put it on YouTube. So we sent that out to like everyone who registered, and it was just people saying like, how do I see if I'm in a flood zone? How do I use the climate vulnerability viewer? Like, do I need flood insurance? And so that was kind of like a live webinar where we answered questions like that, but then posted it so that people could access it later. So I think that is one example, but I think that sounds like something that people might be interested in. It worked for the flooding questions at least.
So I think what I'm hearing here, and so sort of keeping in mind the bounds that ARWG actually works in, right? We're not going to be the group that's on the ground necessarily in those communities. But what might be useful, I think, is what you're saying, is getting together a panel so we can discuss what's working, what's not working, and maybe putting together a one-pager or some sort of a document that says, as city agencies or even, you know, other people who are putting out tools or people who are putting out funding, anything like that, guidance on here are things that you should be doing. You should be having these meetings where you sit down and ask people questions, or basically putting together a document that everybody can utilize to sort of check those boxes or follow that guidance at their own homes. How does that sound for an update to the deliverable or that guidance?
I think there's also a lot more to unpack in here too for next year. I think this is a really good, you know, a good look for us to have around first presentations and support session.
Yeah. So if anybody, in that vein also, if anybody has suggestions on and who comes to mind for a sort of panel of people like this, people either doing good community outreach about tools and maybe gets market analysis needs assessment goes in that panel discussion, things like that, please send those comments to me so I can start organizing people for next year. Making sure that people's calendars are blocked out. Things like that. Okay, anything else on supporting local governments? Great, I'm gonna scroll to the next one. So this is the last in this top section here for our direct work section. I should have clarified, this is the section that covers things that we will be actively working on as the ARWG and spearheading. Whereas the section we're gonna go into in just a minute is more of work that we are tracking and playing more of a supportive role. So number 4 here is conservation of natural and working lands. And so this is flagging that working land section specifically of NextGen, but working on developing those potentially a panel discussion on land use policies and communications so that we can bring everybody into a room together to discuss how do we prioritize these, because this is happening in real time. You know, we need to get everybody in the room together.
This is something that can really, you know, tap a broader way of affording our resilience too. So it's about our workforce, and it's about an economic model that's sustainable.
So I think a panel discussion does also lend itself well to this topic. I mean, I think panels are a great way to include multiple perspectives. We do have a lot of panels now coming up in the next year, but they've been a good tool, I think, for us. So again, with this topic, if anybody has people or groups that come to mind in this discussion, I think we do have some ideas. I spoke with Ann about this before this meeting, but we are open to any suggestions in the group about who would be great perspective to have on the panel.
One thing I would say is, and maybe I'm missing the point on this, but it might be really nice to include in this sort of solar panels on ag land discussion. It's because it brings together mitigation and adaptation. A little sticky wicket, and it may not be you guys' jurisdiction, I don't know, but jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I don't
Yes.
think we've approached it from the perspective of resilience. I think they've looked at it in NWG. And I don't know if that's something.
Yesterday they did discuss it.
Okay. So, but I think maybe figuring out, and maybe that's like a joint MWGA or WG conversation. I think that's a good one.
There's definitely a lot of commissioners that have a lot to weigh in on.
So we, at our regional state foresters meeting last week, we had a presentation from Massachusetts Audubon that was really looking at how to prioritize protection of biodiversity and where they incentivized solar development. They are right now, you know, changing some of their statewide priorities to reflect not impinging on those the highest value ag, the most productive ag land, the highest value biodiversity land, as they do a lot of forest clearing for solar. The state has a master solar contract that allows solar installation on state land. I know it's a little bit different than that, but I think there's a push on state property as well to expand solar.
Yeah, the discussion yesterday was a little more on the price point of installing solar on various land types, which I think was getting at.
This presentation got into the price point and the fact that depending on how tight you through your push your prioritization, you could probably get, you know, like 80% of your availability and, you know, improve biodiversity protection by 60%.
Sounds like limited.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the type of analysis it might be worth looking at, but we have, I think, different regulations, some than what Massachusetts does that I think has limited some of our impact. But the forthcoming power supply needs, you know, they're really changing. We can't use post AI, we can't pretend that the power generation estimates that we have are what we should be using moving into the forward. There's going to be a lot of demand for energy. We need all hands on deck.
Right, this seems to be an opening and where you know, take a lead in bringing mitigation and adaptation together. Yes. That seems to have been started to be a bit of a discussion at the climate, at the actual MCCC. So maybe this is a way that this group could kind of push on.
Yeah, I think in response to some of the federal opportunities that have come from talking perspective. Touched on the CPRG grant in the last presentation, but I think there's a larger, broader question about those intersections outside of the public space.
And we love a working group crossover. You know, we don't want to operate in our own silos out here.
I can bring that up with the co-chairs.
Yeah. Anybody online have any comments? It's been pretty quiet. Okay, I'm gonna more quickly roll through this since these updates were provided by each of the relevant groups. And again, this is just information that was reported by them on things that they're going to be working on in 2025 and some update from what was worked on in the past year. So I am not going to go over actually each individual item. Please take your time to look at this on your own. And if you would like to see more or have some ideas on how ARWB should be involved in any of these efforts, please feel free to ping the relevant people, either those agencies themselves and me, to keep us all together. So I am going to make a final call. Any comments overall on the work plan? And this is also open. You can send your comments via email. You can send a track changes draft to me or edit in the Google Doc if that's something that you have access to. Please just dialogue with me with your comments. We want to make sure that everyone's thoughts and perspectives are reflected in our work plan here. The final call for comments on anything.
Are you thinking of any field trips?
Field trips, that's a great question. I was not, but I am open to suggestions. Do you have somewhere in mind?
I just thought if the department was working on something that they thought was particularly important and new and wanted to share with us or legislators, that it could be interesting to go see something together as a group.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, we can, why don't we talk about some of the things we've got going on internally at DNR? We can put some potentials out for projects, but maybe also open that up to other members of the work group. I love that idea. I think thank you, Commissioner Mizrahi. I think that's a fantastic idea and a way for us to kind of see the work in action. I think a lot of times when we're in conference rooms, I think that's part of the reason the panels are so great is you can kind of feel like you're in it because you get all those different perspectives. So it's a really good idea.
Yeah, and I think we could schedule that and not a meeting date to just do a little further engagement.
I think a lot of commissioners who are not on this task force would be very interested in that.
Yes, we will definitely send the invite. Great, well, thank you for that. Food for thought and more exciting than a board plan.
Work plan is not.
Thank you. Sorry.
This is a stimulating discussion.
A boring seawall.
Yeah, that's perfect. All right, final comments, last chance. Well, not really, but
Best chance for today.
So, what is the last chance? In terms of,
we will finalize it at the February meeting, so it's going to remain open, but I will be working on updating it as reflective of our discussion we had today in between now and February. So, sometime. All right, well, thank you guys. We are going to shift to looking at nothing because we are saving this time for a policy discussion. This time we have been keeping aside to just talk about any policy ideas as we're gearing up for this session and anything that passed last year that we want to continue discussing. This is just open time. And if we don't need it, then that's okay, but we wanted to have space for it on every ARWB meeting here. So are there any policy items that people would like to bring up for discussion?
it's not,
Go ahead, Allison. No, go ahead, go.
It's not directly tied to a specific policy, but more about like our recommendations flying into policy. So I think the recommendations that come out of the working group, ARWG and others, are really solid. But I think that there's maybe a gap in that we're not tying the recommendations to potential implementation areas in policy. So some of them need a policy change, but they're not referencing the statute. I'm not saying that we need to write the legislation by any means, but if there was a way we could kind of tweak the way we write our recommendations or even reference relevant statute to make it easier to pick up by legislators and like insert into bills. So like last year we had a recommendation around, I think like climate into comp plans. And so including right there, like where comp plans exist in the statute. So not saying that like writing the legislation that would make the modification, but just like giving them that kind of really clear direction as to where it could be implemented or, inserted might help with the kind of adoption of some of these recommendations into policy where a policy component is necessary.
You're entirely right. And I think I remember saying that myself a long time ago, and then I think I got away from it myself. So you're, here it is. Note to self. Be better. No, that's right, that our recommendations should be ready to bundle up for a policy maker if they so choose. So that's good flag.
And some of that comes from, and this isn't anything that any of us would be able to modify because it's in the statute that created the commission, but the report timing comes out, at least from my understanding of the session, at like a weird time for adoption of recommendations into legislation. December is usually like, I don't know, at our agency, we're asked in like June, July for legislative priorities. So if there's a way, we can't modify that, but if there's a way that we can tweak our recommendations to make them easier to adopt in a weird timing, or I guess maybe in the not most efficient timing, I don't want to call it weird.
Yeah, good point.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
in the Science and Technical Working Group, we heard a presentation that typical shoreline restoration is kicking up methane. And so that the work that the state is funding to try and protect our shoreline was also exacerbating the problem. But it was fairly early research, and I don't know if this committee will also be looking at that potential issue.
Yeah, I'll follow up with the Science and Technical Work Group about that. And thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't aware of that presentation. I know there's, a wide range of different research going on related to methane in a lot of our wetland spaces, just the nature of those ecosystems. So I'll follow up with them to get that presentation. Thank you for flagging.
Thanks.
It encourages to make sure we're thinking holistically about these things, making sure we're including the pieces of the system that build, support biodiversity and systems responses. We do have in the natural system some things that run counter to each other, but we have areas where we target forest buffers for nitrogen reduction. Sometimes that we create conditions that like mobilize phosphorus, and then so they don't always work in perfect connection with each other. And we do have to do things that support really the system's response as a whole. But I think there's room to be looking at how do we implement it in ways that maybe minimize some of those negative side effects, while still capturing the really important contributions to our natural systems.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Again, open time for any policy items. Anything that you would like to see in terms of policy that we can maybe start working on in preparation for next year's legislative session, or bundling appropriately for next year's session?
I just flag council policy because it'd be nice to know the position of this group on it. The comment that Terrence Siegel made in the chat, I can just read it, or you can.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is in reference, sorry, to the wetland adaptation discussions that we had, the presentations beforehand. So those last two presentations highlighted long-term monitoring to track wetland elevation and is a key indicator of their health. North Carolina produced a white paper that reported on wetland elevation trend across their monitoring networks. The question is that the Chesapeake Bay Surface Elevation Table Working Group, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay Sentinel Site Cooperative, is positioned to produce a similar analysis, but they don't want to go ahead and do it unless somebody wants it. So it's really an analysis similar to what North Carolina did with a very recent paper that's come out. Karen flagged the words listed on North Carolina Sea Grant's website. Question is there interest in that working group taking on to a similar wetland elevation indicator? And if it's simpler for us to take this offline talk to the DNR wetland folks, we can do that.
Yeah, my first thought is I don't know if we have the right people in the room to make that judgment.
Okay.
Right? I mean, I think we can speak for DNR, but we don't have C's represented anymore, some other people who would
Okay,
benefit
I'm
from that
a
discussion. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just saying.
You're part of it.
I am part of it. We are one.
But I think there's a lot of people that would enjoy having that discussion, and so I'd love to see that.
Okay.
Continue.
Terrence may still be on, but I will relay it and we'll figure out a phone call or something.
Perfect.
Perfect. And it started with email. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention. I missed it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ryland, and thank you everybody for the policy discussions. And again, we are holding this time in the agenda so that when we have really robust discussions and things start to bubble up, we can start capturing them throughout the year so that we can socialize them and really hone quality recommendations for votes and or for the voting at the end of the year, which is the time frame we're in right now. So thank you all for the discussion. We are going to move toward to the last agenda item, which starts with our public comment. So if you are a member of the public and you would like to make a comment today, please put your name in the chat or raise your hand, and we will call on you in that order. And I will, as members of the public put their names in the chat or raise their hand, I would open it up for any members of the public in the room. Seeing none, I think we will stick with online. Okay, seeing none, we need to talk about schedule for next year. Critical next step as we are wrapping up 2024. As we look to the following year, we are planning to stick with that same approach of the last Wednesday of the month. And so currently we would schedule those meetings for February 26th, May 28th, August 27th, and December 3rd. December 3rd, obviously not the last Wednesday of the month, but to not conflict with the Thanksgiving holiday, we're pushing that into the first week of December. We would keep the same time frame, which would be the 2nd or 2 to 4. 2nd to 4, that's not right. The 2 to 4 p.m. So we will be distributing those as well. Please reach out to us if there's any conflicts for anyone, and we can also think about that concept of a scheduling of a field trip to not necessarily to coincide with one of these work group meetings, but as time to get commissioners out into the field. So with that, thank you all very much. I guess I will need a motion to adjourn. No, I don't need that. Thank you, Ryland. All right, thank you all very much for your participation in the ARWG today, and we're looking forward to our February meeting.
Great, thank you. This was great.